long before electricity reached the mountains, long before the hum of compressors and the cold blue light of a refrigerator door swinging open in the dark. There were families living deep in the folds of the Appalachian highlands who kept their food through the bitterest winters, through the longest summers, through years and decades of isolation from the modern world. And they did it without a single wire, without a single machine. What they used instead was older than memory itself. And most of America has forgotten it entirely. Somewhere in the southern highlands, on a morning when the fog still clings low to the ridgelines and the air carries the faint sweetness of wood smoke and damp earth, you can still find the evidence. It's buried beneath old floorboards, hidden behind stone walls, carved into hillsides so quietly that most people walk right past it without a second thought. The mountain families didn't broadcast their knowledge. They didn't write it down in books or teach it in schools. They passed it the way all important things once moved through time. From hand to hand, from season to season, from grandmother to grandchild in the half-dark of a kitchen where something always seemed to be simmering. This is the story of how they did it, and why it may have been wiser than anything we replaced it with. You have to understand something about the mountains first. The Appalachians are old, older than the Rockies, older than almost any range on Earth. They've been worn down by time until they are soft and rounded and draped in dense forest, folded into valleys so narrow that sunlight arrives late and leaves early. The winters here are not polite. The cold comes down from the high ridges without warning, and it settles into the hollows like something that intends to stay. For the families who built their lives here, the Scots-Irish settlers, the Cherokee descendants, the generations of ridge runners and valley farmers who carved homesteads from the timber and stone, surviving a mountain winter was not a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life. They had no hardware stores to run to, no roads that stayed passable in deep snow, no neighbors close enough to borrow from in any real emergency. What they preserved in autumn was precisely what they would eat in February, no more, no less. And so they learned over generations of careful trial and terrible error to become extraordinary stewards of food, not just preserving it, understanding it, working with the mountain itself as a partner. Beneath many Appalachian homes, if you knew where to look, rested a chamber that most visitors never noticed at all. It was dug by hand, sometimes by a single man with a mattock and a determination that the coming winter would not beat him, sometimes by a family working together across several autumn days, passing buckets of dark soil up through a narrow wooden hatch in the kitchen floor. They went down anywhere from 6 to 10 feet into the earth, following the cold, because the earth at that depth maintains a temperature that sits, year-round, somewhere between the low 40s and the mid-50s. It doesn't freeze, it doesn't warm, it simply holds. This was the root cellar, and it was the beating heart of the mountain household. The walls were often stone, fitted together without mortar, and those stone walls wept a faint moisture year-round that kept the air inside just humid enough. Shelves of rough-cut wood ran along every wall. From the ceiling hung braids of dried onions and clusters of garlic, their papery skins rustling if anyone moved quickly past. On the shelves, crocks of pickled beans, their lids sealed with wax. Jars of apple butter so dark it looked almost black. Dried herbs tied in bundles. And in the coolest corner, furthest from the entrance, the apples. The apples were the miracle. Wrapped individually in dry leaves or straw and nested into wooden crates, certain mountain apple varieties, old heirloom strains that most modern orchards no longer grow, would keep in the root cellar from October all the way through March. A family might pull a single apple from that crate on a February afternoon, and it would be crisp, it would be sweet, it would taste like a morning in late September. Time had not touched it, the mountain had kept it. But the root cellar was only one piece of a system that was far more intricate than it first appeared. Walk away from the house down toward the tree line, and you would often find a second structure, smaller, lower to the ground, sometimes built directly over a stream or positioned at the base of the hill where a cold spring seeped out from between the rocks. This was the spring house. And understanding how it worked requires understanding something about cold mountain water that the settlers understood instinctively, but modern plumbing has caused most people to completely forget. Spring water, as it rises from deep underground, emerges at a remarkably consistent temperature regardless of the season. In the highlands of Appalachia, Spring water runs cold year-round, in many cases around 50 degrees even in midsummer when the fields above are baking and the creek has slowed to a trickle. The mountain families channeled this water, deliberately, through shallow stone troughs that ran through the interior of the spring house. And into those troughs they placed their crocks: milk, butter, soft cheeses, fresh meat during the brief periods between slaughter and smoking. Anything that needed cool storage was lowered into those stone channels, half submerged in the steady cold of the mountain spring, and it kept. The spring house wasn't as cold as a modern refrigerator, but it was cold enough. And it was available every single day of the year without fail, powered by nothing more than gravity and the slow patience of water moving through stone. Most outsiders, riding through on horseback or traveling the mountain roads in the early part of the last century, would have seen these low stone structures and assumed they were tool sheds, storage for firewood. They had no idea what they were looking at. The smokehouse stood closer to the main cabin, usually within easy sight of the kitchen door. It was a simple building by most definitions: 4 walls, a low roof, a door that latched tight, and a fire pit dug into the dirt floor. But the simplicity was deceptive, because what happened inside a mountain smokehouse over the course of several days and nights was an act of chemistry and patience that required both skill and intuition. Salt first. The meat, almost always pork, because the mountain hog was the most efficient animal a family could raise, was packed in dry salt and left to cure for weeks. The salt drew moisture from the tissue. Bacteria could not survive without that moisture, and so the curing was already half done before the first coal was ever lit. Then came the smoke. Hickory, most often, or apple wood when it was available. The fire was kept deliberately small, just enough to generate smoke without generating real heat. The goal was not to cook the meat. The goal was to coat it, slowly and completely, in a film of microscopic particles that had antimicrobial properties. The mountain people understood in practice, even if they never used that particular word. A properly smoked shoulder of ham, hung from the rafters of the spring house or the root cellar, would keep for months. Some families claimed certain cuts would last a year or more. This was winter meat. This was the protein that carried a family through the darkest months when the land gave nothing, when the garden was frozen and the livestock needed what little grain remained. The smokehouse wasn't a luxury, it was a vault. And the knowledge of how to use it, the right salt ratio, the right wood, the right duration, the temperature of the fire on the coldest night, that knowledge lived in the hands of the people who practiced it, and in the memories of everyone who watched them. What happened during the harvest months changed everything about how a mountain family would survive the winter that followed. August and September were not months of rest. They were the most urgent, focused, unrelenting weeks of the entire year. Every hand that could work was working. The beans, leather breeches they called them, tough mountain pole beans, were strung on thread and hung from the porch rafters to dry in the autumn air, rattling faintly in the mountain wind like something almost alive. Corn was shucked and the kernels driven from the cob by hand. Pumpkins were cut into strips and dried over the wood stove. Berries were simmered with sugar in heavy iron pots until they thickened into preserves that would hold their sweetness for a year, sealed in glass beneath a layer of paraffin wax. The mountain people were not working from recipes exactly. They were working from memory, from rhythm. There were women in those communities who had never written down a single thing they knew about food preservation, and yet they could look at a jar of canned tomatoes and tell you, from the color of the liquid alone, whether it would keep until spring or whether it needed to be eaten now. That knowledge was not in any book. It lived only in the eyes and the hands of people who had spent 40 or 50 years practicing it. And when those people were gone, when the children moved to the cities and the cabins were left to the ivy and the rot, that knowledge largely went with them. Not all of it, but most. There's something else that deserves to be said. Something that rarely comes up in any discussion of mountain food preservation because it doesn't fit neatly into the category of technique. The Appalachian families who maintained these systems, the root cellars and the spring houses and the smokehouses and the drying sheds, were not merely preserving food. They were practicing a specific relationship with time. They were thinking in August about February. They were tasting a green bean in the garden and already imagining what it would mean to eat it in the dark of a January evening. They were not living from week to week the way most modern households do. They were living from season to season, and the difference between those two orientations is not simply practical, it is psychological. It shapes the way you move through the world. A family that fills its root cellar in October and knows, with reasonable certainty, that it will eat through the winter regardless of what the world does outside, that family experiences a particular kind of peace that is difficult to describe and nearly impossible to buy. It is not comfort exactly. The work was too hard, the margins too thin for comfort. It is something closer to steadiness, a calm that comes from having prepared, from having read the signs of the season and responded to them intelligently, from having honored the patience that the mountain demanded. Modern America forgot this. Not all at once, and not without reason. Refrigeration was a genuine miracle when it arrived in those hills. Electric light and paved roads and grocery stores changed lives in ways that were overwhelmingly positive. No one who has ever watched a child fall ill in a remote hollow in the middle of winter would argue for turning back that clock. But something was lost in the speed of the exchange, not the hardship. No one needs to mourn the hardship, but the orientation, the long thinking, the understanding of food as something you spend months preparing for rather than something you retrieve in 30 seconds from a brightly lit box. There are old men and old women still living in the mountain counties of North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, and West Virginia who remember the root cellars of their grandparents, who remember being sent down to the hatch on cold mornings to bring up the day's ration of apples or sweet potatoes or dried beans, who remember the smell of the place, that particular underground smell of cool earth and cured wood and something faintly sweet that they have never been able to identify or reproduce, who remember thinking, even as children, that the root cellar was a serious place, a place where the family kept its winter, a place that deserved respect. Some of those cellars still exist. The cabins above them may be long fallen, the timbers rotted, the stone chimneys tumbled into the creek, but the cellar itself, dug by hand into the cold mountain earth, lined in stone that will outlast everything built above it, sometimes remains, waiting in the dark for someone to remember what it was for. The mountain families were not primitive. That is the misunderstanding that has followed the Appalachian and people through every era of American history, and it does not hold up to any serious examination. What they built, the integrated system of root cellar and springhouse and smokehouse and drying shed and preserve larder, was a sophisticated multi-layered food security network that operated without machines, without electricity, without refrigerants, and without a single trip to any store. It was designed from first principles, refined over generations, and adapted specifically to the climate and the terrain of the mountain landscape they inhabited. It worked, not perfectly, and not without loss. Some winters were harder than others. Some harvests failed. The mountain was not kind in any sentimental sense of the word, but the system worked well enough that communities survived, year after year, in conditions that would have defeated most people who had not been raised inside that particular kind of knowledge. What defeated it in the end was not better science. It was simply abundance, cheap food, refrigeration that cost almost nothing to operate, supply chains that made the question of winter storage irrelevant because the grocery store 30 miles down the valley now had strawberries in January and chicken wrapped in plastic every day of the year. It's difficult to argue against that, and this is not an argument against it. But it is worth pausing for just a moment to remember what was traded away, and to look at the hollow beneath the old cabin floor, at the dark stone walls still sweating their faint cold moisture, at the wooden shelves where the crocks once sat in the lantern light, and to understand that the people who built that chamber were not primitive at all. They were simply prepared. Today, many of these cabins sit empty beneath the Appalachian fog, their chimneys lean, their porches sag toward the earth. The springhouses are choked with moss, and the smoke from their fires has been gone for 40 years. But deep below the soil, beneath the old floor joists and the fallen hearthstone, the root cellars remain, cold and quiet in the dark, holding the temperature they have always held, waiting, without urgency, for the next long winter. The mountains remember what the people forgot. They always do.